Today we're looking at the end of the Stuart period and the way things were at the beginning of the 18th century. Remember a few weeks ago we looked at the way things were at the end of the 16th century, the beginning of the 17th century, how things have developed during the Tudor period. Well, things have changed even more radically during the Stuart period. So I'd like us to get some sort of sense of what England and Britain is developing into at this stage. The Stuarts continued even after the Glorious Revolution, of course. You know, the two sisters who became queens after that were both Stuarts. James Stuart, sorry, that's my email going. I can't stop that. What can I do? I know. That's right, I'll turn that off. So James escaped to France and the country was ruled by his daughter, but she was obviously also a Stuart. And her husband, William of Orange, so they ruled the country. And then when Mary died, her sister took the throne because Mary had no children. And then after Anne, that was the end of the Stuarts. There were no more Stuarts left. Well, the only Stuarts that were left were James's, if you remember, James had a Catholic son. Okay, now that was going to cause a little bit of trouble later on because that side of the family wanted to get control again, but the country didn't want the Catholic Stuarts back. So they moved things over at this stage to Anne having had 5 stillborn children and 5 children who died at an early age and 7 miscarriages, can be considered particularly unfortunate as a mother. So she left no ancestors, no descendants, despite obviously trying very hard. She had, 17 pregnancies, none of which resulted in a successful surviving child. So that also gives you a little bit of an insight into what life could be like for people in those days. Imagine 17 pregnancies, no child to show for it. Horrific. So that was basically the end of the Stuart line. James II's son had also had a son, and they both tried to become king. And these attempts in, actually I haven't put the dates in here, but it would be, 1715 and 1745. The father and the son tried to become king, mostly with the support of Scotland, who wanted a Scottish king back on the throne. And there was a sort of sentimental thing for Scottish people to have to accept the defeat, a very bloody and nasty defeat in the end of Charles, the young pretender. Pretender in this case does not mean mane wo suru, hito. It means person who wants to be king or tries to be king, the person who's trying, the pretender in the sense of trying. The person who is trying to be king. So, yes, there were 2 attempts in the 18th century for the Catholics to get back control through the Stuart kings, descendants of James, but those attempts both failed. So basically, the nearest relative being the maternal great-grandson, okay, on the mother's side of so they went on to the mother's side of the family, and the great-grandson of James I was George of Hanover, who was in Germany, king of Germany, and eigo demo hanase nakatta. He couldn't even speak English. Okay, so an English king who couldn't speak English. This, you can imagine, dare ga yorokonda? Who would be happy to have an English king who couldn't speak English? Those rich politicians, they had a great time. They could do anything they wanted. The king didn't even speak it, and he wasn't interested in England. He was interested in his possessions in Germany. He spent his time mostly in Germany. So the politics really started to grow strong at this time. You know, they had the first Soridaijin come from this period. The country is beginning to be controlled much more by politicians and not so much by kings and queens. So the Glorious Revolution, one thing that I think everybody can agree about was that the Glorious Revolution showed definitely there is a limit to the power of kings. If we don't like a king, we can get rid of him. And when George I arrives with not much interest in Britain and not even speaking the language, then it's even more opportunity for the politicians, for Parliament, to develop its powers. So the 18th century is going to be a time of political development. You're going to see a lot of political growth, and the politicians are going to be much more important than the king or queen during this period. So we looked before at England's relationship to her neighbours, and that's something that's also developing through this period. So let's take a look at how that's developing. Wales, of course, had basically been completely under the control of England from the time of Henry VIII, who, remember, came from a Welsh family. And very often in those days, England would mean England and Wales. It's kind of a tadimai, Wales is part of England. Okay, so those two countries were together all through, basically through most of the Tudor period and from then on, really. And yes, the fact that the Tudors were a Welsh family, that helped things. And also, as we noticed, the Stuarts were a Scottish family, so Scotland and England became very much closer during the 17th century, but the countries were not formally united until, 1707. 1607. Sorry, that's a little typing mistake there. 1707. And then Scotland and England and Wales together became known as the Kingdom of Great Britain. So that 初めて18世紀の初めぐらい England より Britain となります。Because Scotland and Wales and England are all together. Scotland, Wales, England together is Britain. It's a little bit fushigi for Japanese people because you have Eikoku and you have Igirisu, but you don't have words to make the difference between England and Britain. So it's a little bit, and United Kingdom. So it's a little bit complicated from a Japanese point of view because the Japanese words don't cover the meaning. England, always think England, Anglo land, Anglo-Saxon land. Anglo-Saxon no kuni wa England. And Kelto no kuni wa Scotland, Wales, Ireland. 一緒だったら、この3つの国、ウェールズ、スコットランドとイングランド、ブリテンになります。Okay, and then Ireland, 19世紀の初め、一緒になりました。And so then it becomes the United Kingdom of Britain and Great Britain and Ireland. So these different names are not focused on too much because that's really ato no hanashi. Our story is mostly up to the Stuarts, and this is happening later on. But I will talk about it if you want me to later on. So, but first of all, let me try to explain the situation at this end of the Tudor period. Ireland always had a much more difficult relationship to England. Wales, as we saw, the King of England was from a Welsh family. The King of Scotland was the King of England was from a Scottish family under the Stuarts. But nothing like that happened with Ireland. Ireland was always just kind of there was always a sort of bad feeling. And Oliver Cromwell, Tokuni, Cromwell was a nasty in Ireland and punished the Irish people very strictly. So after that period, the Irish had a very difficult time in their relationship with England, with Britain. Actually, James went to first he went to France, and then afterwards he went to Ireland, and he got Catholic support in Ireland. So again, the English people, the British people, feeling that the Irish are their enemy, because England's enemy, the king who's been Tobasareta Osama, he goes to Ireland to get help. So this sort of Ireland is against Britain. Ireland is against England. And finally, William leads an army into Ireland at the end of the, towards the end of the 17th century, and he leads his army against the They were the supporters of James and his children and his child and grandchild. They were called Jacobites because Latengo de James was Jacobus. So Jacobites means James supporters. And so this war really, James lost very badly. So the Jacobite movement was crushed, was finished. And Catholics also, because of this war, Catholics finally became really down-class, second-class citizens. And for 200 years, Ireland would be controlled by Protestants. So this was really a very, very sad time for Ireland. They lost their Jibun no kuni no naka ni sundeta kedo Catholico Ireland jin ga Protestanto ni controllo sardinia. So they were second-class citizens in their own country. And looking at Ireland, we need to talk about the situation there because it's quite an important relationship. Basically, of course, the English and the British in general had become Protestants while the Irish had remained Catholics. So the government policy after the Reformation was for England to say to English Protestants or British Protestants from Scotland or Wales, please go to Ireland and help us to control these wild Catholic people. So that was the basic policy. And some of them were English, others were Scottish, especially in the north of Ireland, they were mainly Scottish. And so Catholics, more and more, were coming under the control of the Protestant settlers. And then slowly during the 17th century, firstly Catholics were not allowed to hold public office. They weren't allowed to join the army because they were likely to be against the English. From the early 17th century, they were not allowed freedom of religion. They had to go to Church of Eikoko Kyokai no services. They had to go to Church of England services. Until 1652, they were allowed to be members of the House of Commons in Ireland, but they were not, after 1652, even this was not allowed. They were not allowed to take part in politics. And then after this, things quickly start to go much worse. They lose their rights, and here we go. The Restoration gave them a short kind of kyukai from their persecution. QK, yeah. So they had a kind of rest, from their persecution after the Restoration. Many of these laws ended, but then after this war, things got much worse. So here we go. Catholics were not allowed to marry Protestants. Catholics can't have a horse that costs more than 10 yen. Catholics can't buy land. They can't teach. They can't own guns. They can't vote. they can't convert to Protestants become Catholics, are strictly punished. They can't practice the law. They can't inherit land. They're not allowed to go abroad to be educated. And these kinds of things, these kinds of laws are being made against the Irish in their own country. All right. So this is a very strict time when the English quite clearly were punishing the Irish. The English, or around this time, England joins with Scotland and Wales, so it becomes Britain. So the British, you can say. This is really something that's going on in the 18th century. 18世紀、ずっとそうでした。So the Catholics are very strictly controlled inside their own country. And yeah, the period would be from the end of the Williamite War up to 1801, when Ireland joined Britain in the United Kingdom. This period is called the Protestant Ascendancy. Basically means the time of Protestant control of Ireland. And then also during this period, thousands of Irish Catholics. I put here that they were shipped to America as slaves. There's some debate about whether they were actually slaves or whether they were just labourers. Okay, they're more like indentured labourers who had very few rights, but not quite as low class as strict as to call them slaves. But they may, again, it depends which history book you read. Some history books will describe them as slaves, and some history books will say they're labourers. In the print, I changed it to labourers, but up here I've left it as slaves. But it's debated what their status was. Okay, but certainly they were cheap. They were cheap workers who were sent out to America to do cheap work and to work in hard conditions. And then, even then in the 19th century, there was going to continue to be discrimination against Catholics. So Ireland has got a very different kind of history from the rest of Britain. And what have we got here? Last week I said, well, I didn't speak much about it, but I mentioned the British Commonwealth very quickly, and I'm going to go in a little bit more detail about that. It's called the Commonwealth of Nations these days, and it consists of 53 countries. I think, well, the last time I counted it was 53. I don't know if it's changed a little bit recently, but I think it's 53 still. But basically, they were the countries of the British Empire. And it's something to notice that Ireland is not in the British Commonwealth. India is, Pakistan is, many countries of Africa are, Jamaica, parts of the Caribbean. They still want to keep a relationship with Britain even after the empire has ended. But Ireland said, "Mo takusan, we're fed up." So I think it's possible to say that Ireland was the most gyakutai sareteita country. It was the most badly treated country under the empire. Even though most countries still want to have a relationship with Britain through the British Commonwealth or the Commonwealth of Nations, Ireland said, no, we don't want to. Thank you, goodbye, and goodbye. Okay, we had enough. So they formally left the Commonwealth in 1949, after having become independent in 1921. So let's move on and look at not just England's immediate neighbours inside the what we now call the United Kingdom, but in the world. During the second half of the 17th century, there were three wars that England was fighting in Europe, or three particular wars: the Anglo-Dutch Wars, the wars against Holland, and actually England was not terribly successful at this time. But what were they fighting for? What was the point? What did they want? Well, at this stage in the game, Europe is fighting inside itself. European countries are fighting each other for control of other countries, for control of shokuminchi around the world. They're not fighting to take control inside Europe. Okay? I mean, Napoleon later on did. Napoleon tried to take control of different European countries, but mostly they're not fighting, they're not saying, we want to invade your country, we want to control your country. No, we want to control a country that you control over there. For example, India was controlled by, much of India was controlled by France before the British. So the British fight against the French to get control of India. Okay? In the same way, いろんなヨーロッパの国、戦争していた時、植民地をコントロールため。And why was this control of the colonies, the shokuminchi, so important? Because the markets, the goods. All right? Basically, this is all about markets. This is all about the economy. Now, at this stage, England was not particularly successful, and Holland was the kind of main controller of the trading routes during the 17th century. But then in the early 18th century, England starts getting into wars against France, which has also become an important colonizer. And until the middle of the century, they continued these wars. And then by the end of that, well, then also fighting with other European countries. And as a result of all this fighting, they gain an empire. They want to control the colonies, they want to control the trading routes, and they're going to be able to do it. Now, I know I'm going beyond, I'm going kind of talking about the 18th century, but I think it's very important to see how things are developing at this stage. So, basically, when those wars against France ended, we got a United Kingdom, and we got the British had got an empire. They controlled many, many countries around the world. So I'd like to show you how that empire grows up. We start off, if you remember, the beginning of the Tudor period. England had control over Wales. It didn't even have complete control over Wales, but basically Wales was under English control, and a small part of Ireland, you remember we called it the Pale, P-A-L-E, was controlled by the English. So that's the way things were at the beginning of our story when we started 11 weeks ago, when we started this course. Okay? And then, okay, just that little area. Very small, not very important part of the big world. Not even particularly important inside Europe. So then, if we move forward to around about the middle of the 17th century, England's got control over Scotland and Ireland. So it's established pretty full control of its own territory there, Britain and the British Isles. And looking outside those islands, there are colonies in Africa here. Okay, there are colonies in the Americas, all right, in the Caribbean here, and over here in India. All right, that's round about the time of Oliver Cromwell. And then over the next 100 years, these colonies are going to grow and develop. You can see there are several now in India. There's more. It doesn't look like much. I mean, if you go backwards and forwards, there you can say, well, okay, they got a bit more. Okay, we go from here to here. Okay, there's a little bit more here, a little bit more. It doesn't look like all that much. What's important here is the infrastructure. These places have now become permanently established colonies with a highly developed infrastructure. And there's a lot of trading going on. They become much more established. It's not just the size of them, it's the quality of what's there. Okay, 100 years before, middle of the 17th century, they're just a few people living out there, a few white people. By the time they get to the middle of the 18th century, they are towns, small cities. Well, some of them getting to be quite big cities. Okay, it's developing into big communities. It's developing quite fast. But the development of land comes after that. Hello, where are we? So that would be what's happening? Okay, yeah. When you get to the early 20th century, it's going to be looking like this. Okay, at its height. All right, British. Half the world is British. All right, and these maps don't show you the most important thing, because you can see a few little red dots in the middle of the sea here, but you can't see, and you can see one there, but most of them are too small to see. Okay, there'll be all the little islands. Okay, across the oceans many of them were British, and the British Empire was built on sea travel. Of course, they didn't have aeroplanes, so controlling the sea and controlling the oceans and having possession of those little islands. British ships could go anywhere. Oh, there's land over there, and they could go, and it would be British, and they could get fresh food, they could get fresh supplies, so all across these oceans, the British created little bases for themselves as well. So they're just as important, or maybe even more important, than the big land masses sometimes, because that's how they managed to get their ships across the water. They could stop off pretty much anywhere, and that would be part of their empire, so they could get fresh supplies and so on. And today, what's happened? Well, more or less back to where we were before, aren't we? Okay, most of Ireland is gone. But you'll notice there are still some little bits left. Okay, there are still some little areas that are still British. Okay, there's still a sort of shadow of the British Empire left there. The wheel's gone mostly full circle, though. Most of Ireland's independent. Scotland had a referendum 2 years ago and nearly became independent. Okay, they came close to independence, and there are just these small, like the Falkland Islands. I don't know if you remember, Margaret Thatcher had a war about these islands against Argentina. Gibraltar in the south of Spain. One or two little areas that are very small here. You can't see them so much on the map in the Caribbean. A few places like that around the world. But apart from that, the empire is history. So it's something that this history follows on very much from the Tudor and Stuart period. It was Queen Elizabeth who started really a lot of the movement that led finally to the empire. She started the East India Company. I think I talked about that before. I think we need to see this Tudor and Stuart period in the context of this bigger history, broader history. Okay, these are the remaining little areas. Okay, they're too small to see. And I should put Antarctica in there. Antarctica is divided between different countries, and Britain had this British Antarctica, but because there are no people living there, it's not really part of the colonizing process. But so these are the places that are left of the British Empire, small islands or small settlements like that. And then, as I say, the Commonwealth of Nations, which is all of these countries, and you can see that many of these countries were members of the British. They were the colonies of the British Empire, and they are now part of the Commonwealth of Nations, which is not very big, not so well known in Japan because Japan, of course, was never part of this. So it's kind of kankenai for Japan. But it's still quite an important, the cultural and trading relationships between these countries are still quite important even today. And you can see those are that's the old British Empire, and that's the Commonwealth of Nations. Okay, so you can see that there's quite a strong connection. Many of those old empire countries are part of the. Okay. All right. Okay. And they still have political and economic and cultural connections even today. So let's look at how the world was changing during this period. Society was changing, becoming very much more like the kind of world that we live in now. When we look at the beginning of the 17th century, it was normal for people to believe that we were just living this life. It was just, it was this planet, this is not where we live, this is not where we stay, this is just a little place where we can find out if we're going to go to heaven or to hell. That's all this life is. All right? And it was normal for many people to look at life as just being a sort of place, you know, we're just here for a short time. And we're going to die. And that's what's important. Will we go to heaven or will we go to hell when we die? And the whole society was based on that as being the main way of thinking. And that's what the world was. Just a place where you're either going to go to heaven or you're going to go to hell after you die. And the Puritans actually had the effect of changing that way of thinking because, you know, life under the Puritans was not fun. People didn't enjoy living under the Puritans, and they felt, no, come on, even if we are going to die, even if, you know, we are going to go to heaven or hell after we die, we don't want our life here on this world to be totally miserable. You know, I mean, the Puritans cancelled Christmas. I mean, for example, okay, you weren't allowed to have fun. And so that really changed. A lot of people thought, look, okay, yeah, sure, we're going to die and everything, but we are still here in this world, and we want to have some kind of life while we're here. So people's way of thinking changed. The idea of what we call the pleasure principle, the idea that it's okay to enjoy your life, became much more normal. By the end of the 17th century, a lot more people would say, well, you know, well, as we saw, Charles II, you know, wanted to have fun, okay? And the people also agreed with that idea, many of them, most of them, that we have some right to enjoy our life on this planet. And you're getting all sorts of challenges to the old beliefs. For example, witchcraft. Witchcraft actually became, you know, the law changed entirely in the early part of the 18th century. It was, during the 17th century, people could point a finger and say, that person is a witch. And then that person would be punished. In the 18th century, they changed the law. The person who says anybody is a witch must be punished, because there is no such thing as witches. So they completely changed direction. Even if you say, I am a witch, then you must be punished because you are saying something that's not true, because there are no witches. So you can't say that that person is a witch, you can't say that you yourself are a witch. Those things became illegal in the 18th century because there's no such thing as a witch. So people are changing their ways of thinking. Science and philosophy, and Gene King, human rights. There hadn't really been much idea that there was such a thing as human rights until this period at the end of the 17th century. We get 1689, Parliament passes a landmark piece of legislation called the Bill of Rights. This is the first time, really, that the rights of ordinary people have been expressed and written down. And Parliament has to be held frequently. You can't have taxes except the ones that Parliament agrees to. There has to be freedom of speech in Parliament. You can't change the law without the agreement of Parliament. There have to be free elections. There must be no cruel and unusual punishments. There must be no armies in peacetime. And Protestants have the right to carry weapons. So these were rights of the ordinary people. Right now, this one here is being challenged in the courts over Brexit. Okay, the government wants to leave because of the vote of the people. The government says we are going to leave, Britain is going to leave Europe. And one woman stood up, and she's not even a politician. She stood up and said, that's illegal because there's this law, okay? If the Parliament, the whole Parliament, not just the government, but all the politicians, not just the controlling group, but the whole of the Parliament must agree before we change a law like that. And she's challenging that in court right now. The judges, we're still waiting for their final decision. Okay, but that's still here today. That's a right. And she's, some people who say that she's an uragiri mono for her country. She is standing up for our rights. This was a right. This is one of the first rights that the British people got. If we lose that at this stage, it could be very dangerous for the country, because then the government can change anything it wants to and take away people's rights. So these things date from the late Stuart period. And we get the fundamental laws. Jumping around. The fundamental laws of England start to get established at this time. The American Declaration of Independence is connected with this document. The American Bill of Rights, all right, takes some of its ideas from this. The French Declaration of the Rights of Man goes back to this. Okay, this is a very, very important document from the late Stuart period, the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Okay, that also comes back to this document. So this document is the kind of grandfather of all these documents of human rights. Okay, this is the first one. All right, it's England was the first country to have that kind of social revolution and chop off the head of its king and change its social structure. It was also the first country to start putting forward the idea that people have rights. Okay, so sorry, that's not stopped at a very convenient place. Dearie me. Oh well, it doesn't matter. You can see those clearly enough. So, moving away from politics, I'd like to look at the way that society in this period is becoming urban. People are living in cities. Again, you see, Britain was the first big major country where they all, or many of them have their beginnings there. And also in science and technology, you've got the same sort of thing going on. Going right back to the early period of the 17th century or the late 16th century even, you've got Francis Bacon, the father of modern science, developing the scientific method, and all through the 17th century, England is taking a central part in things like astronomy and so forth, and medicine, the understanding of the human body, William Harvey and William Gilbert, developing modern medicine, modern chemistry, Robert Boyle. The Royal Society, set up in 1660, It's a very important body of scientists. So again, in terms of science, well, you've got the Royal Observatory in 1675, and Britain became a leading country, or perhaps the leading country, in the race to map the stars and map the skies and to get a picture of what this universe is like. And then you've got the laws of motion coming from Isaac Newton, the law of gravity, and so on. So you've got science, all of these things helping to make the world much more like the world that we know it today. And these lead the way into the Enlightenment, or also called the Age of Reason. And the Enlightenment also, because of its scientific and rational principles, provides the kind of philosophical background that leads, in terms of the development of society, it leads to the Industrial Revolution.